Hey, if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, encourage you to open to 1 Kings chapter 6. 1 Kings chapter 6. If you have not been with us, then let me just fill you in. Somebody asked if this table was crooked earlier, and the verdict is in. Yes, it is. But yeah, if you haven't been with us, we've been doing a series in the book of 1 Kings, and if you're like, man, 1 Kings, why 1 Kings? For the exact reason you asked that question, that's why. That 1 Kings is a book that is often, a lot of Old Testament narrative books are books that we often kind of neglect when it comes to reading our Bibles. We tend to go to kind of the same ones over and over again, and I think it's good for us to stretch ourselves a little bit. I think it's good for us to read books that we don't typically read, or to maybe gain some understanding of some things. And tonight what we're going to do is we're going to be looking in 1 Kings. We're going to be looking in chapter 6 and 7, but we're going to be all over the Bible. But as you are turning there, I want to ask you a question. What is, and don't answer out loud, just think about it, what is the most important thing to you? If I was to go around the room and ask each person in an interview style with the microphone out and ask you, what is the most important thing in your life, I'd probably get a variety of different answers. I'd probably get, okay, like family, right? Or maybe, you're that type of person. Maybe you're not super close to your family, but like your friends are your family, right? So you would say maybe my friends, or other people would say like my health, or, maybe you're one of those people who are like, my dog, or my cat, or my goldfish. Maybe some of you are like, honestly, my grades are really important to me. Maybe you would say, people's opinions of me is probably the thing that's the most important to me. Maybe you would be that person who would say, man, my relationship with God is what's most important to me, and that's awesome. But we would get all of these different answers. And then, if there was a way for me to watch your life, what if there was a way for me to watch your life and then come back to you after a week and say, hey, based off the way you live, this is what I have observed is the most important to you? Would it line up with what you told me? Would the way that you live your life reflect what you say is most important? And if we're honest, I think all of us in this room could probably have to come to grips with the fact that honestly, it's probably not. That what we say is most important oftentimes is actually not that important to us in comparison to other things. Not that it isn't important at all, right? Like, I don't think anybody in here who is, you're pursuing Jesus and all these different things, I wouldn't say that, like, your relationship with God is not important to you. I just think if we're honest, there are other things that you find more important. I think that God has different ways of revealing to us what is most important in our lives. When we look at the story in the life of Solomon, what you'll find in the life of Solomon is you'll find a guy who starts off pretty good. Doing pretty good things. We saw this last week, right? Where God comes to Solomon and says, whatever you ask of me, I will give to you. And what does Solomon say? He says, Lord, I'm young. I don't know how to lead these people, Israel. Give me wisdom so that I may lead them properly. And God was pleased with what he asked for. And he was so pleased with what he asked for, they actually gave him everything else that he didn't ask for on top of what he asked for. You're like, man, Solomon seems to be getting it right here. But then as you read the rest of 1 Kings and you read the rest of Solomon's story, you start to see, Solomon has some issues. Solomon seems to have some problems. Ultimately, what you'll find is that it's Solomon's introduction of idol worship into the lives of the people of Israel that starts Israel on its path towards total destruction and ultimately towards exile into Babylon. That Solomon is really the first snowball that starts this thing. And the question you have to ask yourself is, was he always, what led Solomon to be like? What's led Solomon to this? And what you'll find, I believe, that we're going to see tonight is that ultimately Solomon had already had disordered priorities. Which we're going to get into here in just a second. At this point in the book of Kings, starting in chapter 6, at this point in the book of Kings, Solomon has been firmly established as king. If you were with us a couple weeks ago, we talked about this, that how Solomon became king. And one thing that's important to understand is that when Solomon became king, it was in the midst of a lot of controversy, right? Because Solomon's brother His older brother was trying to usurp David as king and trying to assert himself to be king, if you remember this. But God had already told David that Solomon was to be king, and so there's all these problems. And once that's settled, Solomon becomes king, and Solomon still has some more adversaries. And if you read, the next chapter or so after Solomon becomes king, eventually all of Solomon's adversaries are essentially they're put to death. And Solomon is now firmly established as king. All the dust has settled, and now Solomon is the king of Israel. All the dust has settled, and now there's peace in Israel. It's a peaceful time. That was actually one of the promises that God made to David, that Solomon would be king in a time of peace. And during this time, this is when God granted Solomon with incredible wisdom to govern the people of Israel. And then we have our verse that we're going to start with tonight. So 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. If you want to stand, it's going to be one verse. So, man, I hope you can hang in there for me. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says this: In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, and the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. You can go ahead and grab a seat. Now, there's a lot of things. I've told you this before. I told you this the first time that we got together. First time, our first week in the book of Kings, I told you that there are things that if you don't understand them prior to this, you're not going to grasp the significance of what's happening. Right? There's been nothing in the book of Kings to this point to indicate to you how significant this verse is. That Solomon is going to begin to build the house of the Lord. He's going to begin to build the temple. So what I want us to do first, I want us to see the significance of the temple and the significance of God's presence amongst his people. So Solomon begins to build the temple. Now, this idea of the temple in Jerusalem will have massive importance all throughout the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. If you remember that one of the accusations that was brought against Jesus when he was arrested and he was on trial was that these people accused Jesus of saying what? This man says that he will destroy the temple. It was one of the accusations they brought against Jesus to accuse him of blasphemy, to ultimately put him to death. That the temple in Jerusalem was of massive importance to the Jewish people. So we have to ask ourselves, well, why? Why is it so important? Well, I want us to notice how chapter 6 starts, right? What does it say? In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. So let's just grasp this, okay? If you go to when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, he leads them out of slavery. We are about almost 500 years since that event. So in the span of that time, God freed the Israelites from slavery. He gave them the law through Moses. He gave them the details of how to construct the Ark of the Covenant, which would symbolize God's presence with his people. And then he gave them the details of how they should build the tabernacle, which we're going to talk about in a second. You have the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. You have the conquering of the land, of the promised land, as you have in the book of Joshua. You have the reigns of all of the judges. Then you have the establishment of kings in Israel with Saul, and then ultimately you get to David and the long process of David's life to where he eventually becomes king, and he reigns for 40 years, which brings us to where we are right now. Solomon, firmly established as king. He's in the 4th year of his reign, and he's approximately 22 years old. During this time, the Ark of the Covenant, which was essentially like, if you've seen Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? The Ark of the Covenant was a gold box that the people of Israel carried around, and it was, God instructed them to do this, and it was something that symbolized God's presence among his people. And it was being kept in the tabernacle. Now, what is a tabernacle? The tabernacle was essentially like a portable temple. It was a tent. It was a series of curtains and all of these different things that they carried around with them every time as they were moving through the wilderness. They would come, and then the presence of God was, what was the presence of God while they were wandering in the wilderness? How did it appear? How did it appear during the day? A cloud. And how did it appear during the night? A pillar of fire, right? And whenever the cloud would stop, what would they do? They would set up the tabernacle, and then the cloud would rest over the tabernacle, and that would be where they would stay until the cloud would raise up again, and then they would pack up, and then they'd go. And this tabernacle was also called the tent of meeting. Why? Because the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, this is where God's presence was made manifest amongst his people. It was made real. It was made tangible. It was something that they could encounter. And this is where Moses would go into the tabernacle, and he would literally meet with God. Scripture tells us that he would speak with God as one speaks to a friend. This is the place where Moses would meet with God, where God's presence was made real. Now, so what we're talking about is God's presence amongst his people. That's the significance. Now, we need to remember, when we talk about God being present, we need to know this, is that God is omnipresent. What does that mean? Omni, meaning all, present, meaning present. So God is present everywhere. There's nowhere that you can go where God is not there. Right, it's where the psalm talks about, if I ascend to the highest heavens, or if I sink to the depths of the sea, that your spirit is there, that there's nowhere that you or I can go to escape the presence of God. So if that is the case, what do we mean when we say that God's presence filled the temple, or God's presence descended on the tabernacle? What do we mean when we talk about the special presence of God? Even Paul in the book of Acts, chapter 17, would say this, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and of earth, does not live in temples made by man. So when we say God's presence was over the tabernacle and eventually will fill the temple, what is happening? Here's what we're talking about. When we say this, we are talking about the experience of his presence, in which God shows himself to us in a way that causes us to experience him more fully. Does this make sense? That God's presence is already where you are, but when we're talking about God's manifesting his presence or making his presence made known to us, it is an experience of his presence in our lives, where we experience him in a fuller way. This is why when James says, James chapter 4, verse 8, he says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. He is not saying that you have to go to a place. He's not saying you have to go to a place to draw. It's not a physical place where you go and you are closer to God. He's talking about something different. He's calling us in James chapter 4, verse 8 to draw near to God. He's inviting us to a deeper, fuller, more powerful, more joyful experience of God's presence in a tangible way. Does this make sense? It's not that there is a map and God says, all right, draw near to me. No, it is an invitation to experience my presence in a new way, in a fresh way, in a powerful way. And this is represented by God's manifested presence in the tabernacle. So what we do spiritually in drawing near to God, they would do physically in drawing near to the presence of God in the tabernacle. It's a picture. This is where men would go to meet with God. So here's the question, though. How do we draw near to God? If it's not a tangible place that we go, how do we do this? How do we draw near to God? We draw near to God by pursuing holiness and obedience. That's how. Now, I want to be very clear. Your obedience does not dictate God's presence in your life in a salvational way. Meaning this, is that if you disobey, God's not going to depart from you. But I will tell you this, your obedience will absolutely impact your experience of God's presence in your life. Does this make sense? Many of us, there's times where, we struggle to feel God's presence in our life. We almost sometimes wonder if God is even real. And I'll tell you that not all the time, but possibly, you need to ask yourself, are you pursuing holiness? Are you pursuing obedience when it comes to God? Because that is how you draw near to him. Casting off sin and pursuing righteousness. This is what was represented in the tabernacle. They would come, they would meet with God here. They would offer sacrifices to God in the tabernacle. And then eventually when the temple is built, they would come and they would offer sacrifices in the temple. They would meet with God in the temple. And to this day, if you were to go to Israel, if you were to go to Jerusalem, I have seen it with my own eyes. You will see Jews 24/7 at the rubble of what is left of Herod's temple in Jerusalem, praying that God would restore the temple. You will go, and there are prayers that are folded up in little pieces of paper that are shoved into the cracks of ancient stones because they are just begging God to come and restore the glory of the temple as he did. The temple meant everything to them, and to this day it still means everything to them. You see, the idea of God being present with his people is the core of our faith, is it not? That God did not create us and put us on this earth just to see what would happen, but that God is near to us, that he is present with us. Where do we see this? We see this all over the place. Look at the Garden of Eden. What does it say? It says in the Garden of Eden that God would walk in the midst of the garden with Adam and Eve. In Exodus, God's presence with Israel is what set them apart. Exodus 33. Moses says, and God says, and my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And he, being Moses, said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not that you are going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? Know this, guys, that when we speak about God's special presence in our lives and in the lives of his people, we are talking about something that is center to what we believe as Christians. The presence of God in your life. And here's what I want you to know. The people of God have always been marked by the presence of God. Always. The people of God have always been marked by the presence of God. This is why, what happens when we are saved? I don't have it in my notes, I don't have it on the screen, but if we flip to Ephesians chapter 1. What happens when we are saved according to Ephesians chapter 1? In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will, so that we who were the first to hope in Christ might be to the praise of his glory. In him you also, when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and believed in him. So when you believed in God, when you were saved, what happened? You were sealed with what? The promised Holy Spirit, who is the guarantee of our inheritance until we acquire possession of it to the praise of his glory. What are we seeing? Is that just like in the Old Testament, the presence of God is what marked the people as the people of God, just like that now, it is like that today. That what makes you distinct, what identifies you as a person, as someone who's a child of God, is the Holy Spirit of God dwelling within you. And if he is not dwelling within you, then you are not his. Simple as that. The presence of God is massively important. From the Garden of Eden to the wilderness to the temple and to the day of Pentecost. So here's the question for you. Do you value God's presence in your life like this? How often do you ask God, God, make your presence known to me? How often do you ask God, as Moses did in Exodus, he says, God, show me your glory. Are you hungry to draw near to God and to meet with him? I want you to know that God is not more present here than he is at your home. But I will tell you this, that I think that there is biblical precedent and historical precedent to say that God's presence is that we get to experience God's presence in a fuller and more special way when we gather together on Sunday mornings. That there is a presence of God that you experience when you gather with other believers that you do not get on your own. So here's why I say this. That if you know that there is an opportunity to experience the presence of God with other believers on a Sunday morning, and you willingly choose not to go, don't tell me that you value the presence of God, because your actions show otherwise. It's like an episode, there's an episode of SpongeBob. Everything can relate back to SpongeBob. And maybe I'm dating myself because I feel like SpongeBob is actually more my age than yours, but there's an episode where there's the Krusty Krab that has no one's come in for a long time. It's dusty and it's gross and no one's come in. And this guy comes in and he's starving. He's crawling on his hands. He's like, food, water. Paul knows what I'm talking about. Atmosphere. All right. And he's starving. And what happens is, and they come up to him and they're like, hey, like, oh, welcome to Krusty Krab. Like, here's a Krabby Patty. And he's like, are you serious? He's like, no. He's like, look at this place. And what does he say? He's like, what's the theme? Underwater? Like, and he's just like, no, like this doesn't have the vibe that I'm looking for. And then he crawls away saying, what? Food, water, atmosphere. What? Well, you look at that guy, you're like, all right, clearly you're not actually hungry. You may think you're hungry, but clearly you're not hungry. I want you to know this. If you are hungry for the presence of God in your life, it will be made known by the way you live. Secondly, I will give you this quote from my boy, A.W. Tozer. He said this. He goes, every man has as much of God as he wants. Let that sink in for a second. You have as much of God as you want. If you don't have more, it's because you don't want more. If you want more, go get it. Pursue Him. Pursue holiness. Pursue righteousness. Spend time on your knees in prayer and in your word. I spent more time on that point than I thought. But you see the importance, the significance of the temple and the presence of God amongst His people. Second thing I want us to look at is David's desire. Again, this is not in 1st or 2nd Kings. Remember, we've only read one verse in 1 Kings chapter 6. Was that Solomon was going to set out to build the temple. All right, what's the point of the temple? Is that the temple is going to be a permanent residence for the ark of God, the presence of God, right? Why? Because to this point, it's been in a tent. For over 400 years, the presence of God, the ark of the covenant, has resided in a tent. And we get to David. David, knowing this, knowing the significance of this meeting place with God, feels conviction because what happens is that there's a time of peace, and what does David notice about his own life? 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, should be on the screen. It says, now, when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his surrounding enemies. Think about this. If you know the story of David, you know that this boy did not have a whole lot of peace and rest in his life. He was constantly at war, constantly fighting, constantly striving. And he wasn't fighting somebody. He was running from somebody who was trying to fight him. And he's finally king, and God has given him rest and peace from all of his enemies. Verse 2, the king said to Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. What does David notice? David acknowledges something important here. He sees that there is a disparity. There is a stark difference between the reverence that is being shown to him as king and the reverence that is being shown to the presence of God amongst his people, which is now sitting in a tent. And he sees this. He sees that this is a problem. He said, this should not be. So what does he say? I'm going to build a house for God amongst his people. Now what you notice, I want you to notice something about this here. God never commanded David to do this. God never commanded David to do this. He never commanded David to build the temple. But notice that David had a desire to go beyond what was commanded, because he desired to please God. You see that? And isn't it true that we are so unlike David? So many of us in this room, we just say, okay, what has God commanded? And what is the bare minimum I can do to do that? What's the bare minimum that I can do and still honor God? When you have David, on the other hand, who's not saying, what's the bare minimum that I can do, and God still be pleased with me. And David's saying, what can I possibly do for God? What more could I do for God, given how much He has done for me? I know that God has commanded this of me, and I'm going to do that faithfully, but I want to do more for Him. I want to do more for Him. Many of us are simply seeking to avoid sin, which is not bad. We should avoid sin, but we're just seeking to avoid sin. That's all we want to do. I just don't want to blow it. But David was seeking to please God. That's the difference. Many of us in this room are probably seeking to avoid sin, but how many of us make it our aim not to just avoid sin, but we make it our aim to, I want to please God with my life. I want to go beyond just not doing bad things. And while these two are very similar, they're very different. Like, I want to give you an example of like sports. I'm a Florida Gator fan through and through. Thank you. Well, I mean, that's fine. I'll pray for you. But here's there was a game last season. Florida Gators were on the road against the Tennessee Volunteers. And they honestly, they should have won the game. They lost in like double overtime. But there was a point in the game where Florida has the ball and they could go for it. Get the play. And what do? They run this wide end play, and they don't get it, and it's just stupid. And what do you have? And Florida Gator fans were just ridiculing the coach. Why? Because they were saying that he coached scared. In that moment, he was more afraid of losing than he was wanting to win. And there's two ways to approach sports. You're afraid to lose, which will drive you to do just enough to not lose, or you love to win, which will drive you to do whatever it takes to win. If I had to pick one of those people to be on my team, the one who's afraid to lose and the one that loves to win, give me the one that loves to win every time. Likewise, how would you identify your life? Are you seeking to simply avoid sin, or are you wanting to please God? First Corinthians 9, 24 through 27. Paul gives us an imagery of this. He says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we do it for an imperishable one. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body, and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." What is Paul saying here? He's like saying this: in a race, all of the runners run, but only one wins it. Treat your relationship with God like that. Run like you're trying to win. Seek to please God like it's a competition. Love God so much that you want to please Him with everything that you do, not just get by. David had a desire to please God beyond God's commands. But as you continue reading in 2 Samuel, what you'll find is that God does not allow David to build this temple. He doesn't allow David to build this temple. What you'll find is the reason is because David has too much blood on his hands. But notice the kindness of God, where God will honor David's desire by allowing David's son to build the temple, Solomon, which is where we pick up in 1 Kings chapter 6, where it says that now Solomon set out to build the house of the Lord. So David is going to get the plans of of this temple, and he's going to take these plans, he's going to pass them down to his son Solomon, who will seek to carry out the construction of the temple. 1 Chronicles 28, 9 through 21. We see this happen. "And you, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father and serve him with your whole heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Be careful now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it." Verse 11, "Then God gave Solomon his son the plan of the vestibule of the temple and of its houses, of its treasuries, of its upper rooms and its inner chambers, and of the room of the mercy seat, and the plan of all that he had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, all the surrounding chambers, the treasuries of the house of God, the treasuries for dedicated gifts, for the divisions of the priests and the Levites." And it goes on and on and on and on and on. If you were to read the rest of 1 Kings chapter 6 and the rest of all these other things, that the temple was incredibly detailed. And when you read 1 Kings, it almost is just like, you're just like, oh, just let it end, because there's so much detail in the temple. But here's what I want you to understand, is that God is interested in the details. God is interested in the details. Verse 20. Then David said to Solomon his son, be strong and courageous and do it. I want you to notice something, right? God closed the door for David. He did not let David build this temple, even though it was David who wanted to do it. But he didn't close the door on the temple being built. And think of it. Naturally, David could have just sat back and said, oh, well, you know what? If I can't do it, then why do it? Right? If I can't do it, then why do it? But that's not what David did. What did David do? David said, okay, I can't build it, but I can do other things. So what happened? David got busy with what he could do. David did what he could do so that he could set up the work for those who would come after him and actually do the work. Do you see the significance of this? Is that David would not be able to do the thing that he set his heart to do, but because God told him, but what he does do is that he's like, you know what, I can't do this, but I can set it up for the people who come after me so that they can do it. Why? Because David didn't care if he got the credit for it. He just wanted God to be glorified. What you see here is David's desire to please God was genuine. It wasn't about him. And David is not perfect. Trust me. We read plenty of instances where David's not perfect, but David was genuine. It wasn't about himself. See, many people want to see God's kingdom expanded through their efforts, and they get annoyed when God's kingdom is expanded through someone else's efforts. They want the credit. Like me and Brock, we take turns preaching, right? I'll preach 2 weeks, he'll preach 2 weeks. It would be like this. It would be like I preach. No, here's a better example. When you go to camp, you have a guest preacher who comes in and preaches. And they tell you the same things that I have told you. But when they say it, man, it hits different. And people get saved. And they get, man, they're crying, and they just commit their lives to the Lord. They recommit. Some are like, I want to get baptized. I want to be a missionary. I want to do all these things. And it would be like this, me being upset. Why don't they do that when I preach? See the problem here? Who cares who gets the credit? God gets the credit. We're here to glorify God, not ourselves. And David understood this. Man, we need to get our eyes off of ourselves. The way that you are living your life right now, ask yourself, how are you setting up for the work that will come after you? And some of you are like, well, Mike, we're not building temples. Correct. You're not building temples. But you know what you and I are a part of? We've been given the greatest mission we could ever receive, and that is to make disciples of all people. To make Jesus famous in the world, to share the gospel, to make disciples. We've been given this mission. To make him known. And here's the thing that I want you to think about when it comes to making disciples. This is a radical way to think about it. But I want you to do this. Don't think solely about the person you are discipling. Think about the people that person will disciple because of your influence. Not to applaud me or anything, because I am not perfect at all. I made a whole lot of mistakes. But I think of like a Brandon Glisson. Some of you know Brandon, some of you don't. I invested a lot of years into Brandon. When I got to go to D-Now and I got to be there, I had a student that was a part of, because Brandon is a student pastor at a church up in Gainesville, and I had one of his students come up to me. He says, hey, Brandon discipled me one-on-one for a long time. He goes, so I guess you're kind of like my spiritual grandfather. That's the way he put it. Do you know what that means to hear that? That there are people walking with Jesus, not because I did anything in their life, but because God allowed me to be used in the life of the person who is discipling them. Some of you are like, man, there's this person in your life that you need to share the gospel with. Yes, you should care about that person, but also care about the dozens of people that that person could reach because you were faithful to reach one. Think of your spiritual grandkids. Mordecai Ham. Some of you don't know who that is. I don't think anybody in this room knows who Mordecai Ham is. Mordecai Ham, which, while it's a name that none of you know, Mordecai Ham was born in 1877. He would die in 1961 at the age of 84 years old. He was an evangelist and he was a preacher. He preached in the early 20th century. He played a pretty prominent role in the American revivalist movement at the time. But like I said, I can tell you all of this stuff and no one in this room has ever heard of him. So why do I bring up Mordecai Ham? Because at a revival in 1934 in Charlotte, North Carolina, Mordecai Ham was preaching the gospel. And sitting in the crowd was a 16-year-old boy named Billy. Billy would give his life to Christ at that rally, at that revival. Billy, 16-year-old boy, Billy, was saved after hearing a Mordecai Ham sermon. And this Billy, over the course of the next 84 years, that young 16-year-old boy named Billy Graham would go on to preach the gospel to over 215 million people in 185 countries and territories. He would sit before kings and queens and emperors and presidents. He is widely regarded as the greatest American evangelist of all time. Now let me ask you a question. Do you think that Mordecai Ham had any idea when he preached at that revival that the greatest evangelist in Western history was sitting in the room? Of course not. But you know what happens when you value the mission of God over yourself? You look beyond what is right in front of you, and you consider the people who will hear the gospel because of the one that is right in front of you. Do you hear me? My goal in life is not to be Billy Graham. I'd love it if I could be. I want to be a Mordecai Ham. I want to be someone who's just faithful with the one and let that one go and reach 200 million people with the gospel. And that's good enough for me. I'll tell you this. Until the mission of God is bigger than your ambitions, you will never make disciples. Until the mission of God is bigger than you, you'll never make disciples. Which brings us back to 1 Kings 6. As you read the rest of the chapter, you'll see all these specifications for the temple, incredibly ornate, incredibly detailed. The temple, if you were to do some modern calculations of everything, of how much it costs, the temple today would cost approximately, on the low end, about $250 billion. High-end estimates would put it at about $500 billion. Then you get to the end of the chapter, and you see this, chapter 6, verse 37 and 38. I'm almost done. It says, in the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv, and in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month. The house was finished in all of its parts and according to all of its specifications. He was 7 years in building it. Solomon spent 7 years building the temple. Like, man, that's a lot, right? Going back to our original question, what's most important to you? Well, Solomon, it is clear that building the temple was important to Solomon. Well, let's read the very next verse. In 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. Verse 38, he was 7 years in building it. Verse 1 of chapter 7, Solomon was building his own house for 13 years. And he finished his house. Do you see something there? You see the problem? What's the problem? If you read the rest of chapter 7, you'll see all the specifications for Solomon's palace. And what will you find is that it's about twice the size of the temple. It was called the house. It was called the house was the forest of the forest of Lebanon is what the house was called. Why? Is because wood was highly valued at this time. In Israel, you don't get most of it, especially in this portion of Israel, all of the wood essentially is olive wood. And if you've ever seen an olive trees don't grow very tall. So it's hard to build a whole lot of things out of wood with a very short tree. So you get these cedars, you get these trees from Lebanon, which is north of Israel. Even today, Lebanon is known for its cedar wood. And Solomon's palace was so ornate, it was so incredible that it was known throughout history as the house of the cedars of the forest, or as the house was the forest of Lebanon. He had 500 golden shields hanging through his palace. He spent twice as much time building his own house as he did the temple of God. And notice the drop-off. Because what led David to want to build the temple is that he noticed his house was better than the Lord's house. And he's like, that's not acceptable. So here's the thing that you notice, is that while he could pass the plans on to Solomon, he could not pass the desire that led to the plans down to Solomon. Because then what happened? Solomon spent twice as much time building his own house. I think there's something there. I think there's a lot of us in this room that we would say that making disciples is important to us. And I don't think you're lying to me. I don't think you're lying to yourself, honestly. I'm sure it is important to you. But let me ask you a question. How much time do you spend in building your own kingdom rather than expanding God's? Going back to what I originally asked you, if I was to look at your life, how far down the list of priorities would it take for me to get to making disciples on your list? Not trying to be mean, but for some of you, I bet it probably wouldn't even be on the list. Solomon was more interested in himself. So when you see this, it's very subtle, but you see this early on in Solomon's life. So that when you get to the point where Solomon is introducing these idols into, why does he introduce all these idols? Why? It's because, and people know that Solomon had bunch of hundreds of wives and all this stuff. Part of the reason he had all these wives is because Solomon was establishing treaties with other nations. And how you would establish these treaties, hey, we're going to have this treaty between me and you, and as a sign of this treaty, I will marry your daughter. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying that's how it went, okay? And these foreign women would come in, and what would he do? He said, well, I want you to feel at home. So, hey, who's the pagan god that you worship? Let me just bring him in here and, let you do your thing. See, because Solomon was so interested in building Israel, building himself, that he lost sight of what's actually most important. I wonder if you've done the same thing. Now, if you go to Ecclesiastes, and I told you we're going to be everywhere, chapter 2, verse 9 through 11, Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon towards the end of his life. It's not specifically told that it's Solomon, but it does say the son of David, the king of Israel. Narrows it down pretty good. He talks about all of the wisdom that he had. So we're like, yeah, it's probably Solomon. This is towards the end of his life. And I want you to see that when you read Ecclesiastes, you see a very different Solomon than you see in 1 Kings. You see an old Solomon. Verse 9 says, so I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil that I had expended in doing it. I looked at everything I did. I looked at the size of my house. I looked at the temple. I looked at all of these things that I have. I looked at all of the wives. I looked at all of the gold. I looked at the fact that the equivalent of $250 billion to build a temple, and I built a house that's even bigger and nicer than that. And what did he feel when he looked at all of it? at the end of his life. And behold, all of it was vanity. If you don't know what vanity means, all of it was worthless. And striving after the wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Here's what I want you guys to know. That a lot of us, including myself, we're investing so much time into building things that when we die, it won't matter. That when you get to the end of your life, you realize, man, all those things didn't matter. I'll tell you this, some of you, when you graduate high school, you will learn quickly. All of these things I cared about when I was in high school don't matter. You'll never see them again. And if you do, you may not even recognize them. They probably won't recognize you. How much of us are sacrificing the things that are eternal for the things that ultimately at the end of our life we'll look back and realize it didn't matter? All the effort that we put into building our own kingdom eventually washes away into nothing. So here's what I want to challenge you with. Don't waste your life with things that don't matter. If you're going to expend your life building something, expend your life building and expanding the kingdom of God. Expend your life, sell out. Be able to say at the end of your life, you gave everything you had to the mission of God. Because I'll guarantee you this, you'll never stand before God and God tell you, I wish you would have done less disciple making than you did. Billy Graham, I mentioned him earlier. He died at the age of 99. Towards the end of his life, people asked him if he could do anything different with his life, what would he do? And this is a dude who has seen it all. He is regarded as preaching to the largest live in-person crowd ever. In South Korea, 1.1 million people gathered in one place to hear Billy Graham preach the gospel. They asked him, what would you do different about your life? And you know what he said? He said, I would have prayed more. How many of us would say that right now? If I could change anything about my life, I wish I prayed more than I do. We don't feel that now, but when you're 99 years old and you're on the front step of walking into eternity, things gain perspective.